Okay, we're live.
Okay, welcome everybody to this seventh Cryptoeconomics session. And today we have Andrew joining us, and he will speak about personal data and also how this is related to incentive structures. So please go ahead.
Cool. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Start? Okay, perfect. Never quite positive if I set that up right. Okay, morning everybody. I'm Andrew Hill. I'm out here in San Francisco, so it's nice and early for me. I haven't got my coffee yet, but I'm going to talk to you today about a bunch of different sort of related concepts to personal data, primarily around how personal data is entering decentralized systems and how we can incentivize people to bring more of their data to decentralized systems. But this is a topic pretty on the sort of leading edge of my domain, and so I'm not going to try to go too far into the things that I'm not really certain about. But I do want to touch on some of the concepts there. But I think all of you are going to be far ahead of me on like the actual cryptoeconomics. But as far as incentives for people around their personal data, that's what I really want to focus on today. So I'm building a project called Textile. We are trying to build essentially a personal digital wallet for data. So a place where you can store all of your digital data and then authorize applications and algorithms to access it or create value on top of it. But I'm not going to talk much about that today, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it. But I invite you all to check it out. Textile.photos is our first application on top of the wallet. And so if you just go to textile.photos, you can see that. So to start the topic for today, I want to talk about centralized technology and really how and why it was so important in shaping our understanding and our relationship with personal data. In the announcement for today's talk, I shared a blog post that I think is really interesting about how the relationship between centralized systems and centralized companies changes with its users over time. And I'm going to come back to that, but I'm going to kind of represent some of the information from that blog post, but then layer on top of it some ideas of personal data, which isn't really brought up directly in that blog post. So starting in the 80s and 90s, or during the 80s and 90s, we really saw the foundations laid for most of the modern technology with online technology. And during that period, it was really driven by open protocols defining how those systems worked. So open protocols and controlled by the community. So limited authority points, but still having a very tall barrier to entry. So at this point, if you wanted to say get an email account, you did actually have to be part of a university with a sysadmin, or you had to run your own systems to have a mail server. So it was very open, but still very hard to become part of. And so during this period, there were very few forms of personal data actually created or transferred. So if you think about it, there was information about your IP addresses, there was actual messages that you sent and emails that you sent, but very little actual information about the users of the networks. And a lot of the reason for that was there was no real use for it. The primary use that we see for personal data still today is in marketplaces. So places that are going to aggregate and sell your data, and then places that are going to buy and create knowledge on top of that data. And so at the time, there were very few motivations for collecting that personal data. But we saw the sort of the pendulum shift from this period of mostly decentralized technologies towards a period in the 2000s of strong centralizing forces. And so the interesting thing about this emergence of centralized companies during this period is that they were primarily built on top of the centralized systems that came before them, right? But what they did is they sort of centralized a lot of their technology, centralized their user information, and really focused their developer efforts on these closed systems. And there was actually a lot of value that was created during that period. And it's not to say that this is a bad thing at all. It actually lowered the barrier of entry to a lot of technologies. So if you think of email, for example, and the number of people that were able to use Gmail or email clients, obviously that came before Google. And so it actually accelerated the growth of the internet as we know it quite a lot, but primarily because these centralized systems were able to grow so quickly and outpace the decentralized systems that came before them. And so in sort of the 10-year period kicked off in the early 2000s, we saw kind of a totally new world emerge, right? And so here from 2006 to 2016, you can see the top 10 highest valued companies. And you can see that there's been a pretty big turnover, but some of the biggest ones by 2016, right, are these centralized technology companies. So the Apple, Alphabet, Facebook, and Amazon, and Microsoft in there too, but they actually were in the old one too. But the thing that's so interesting about this happening in the early 2000s is it's also the period where our relationship to personal data also emerged, right? So because there was no real collection or aggregation or sharing of personal data prior to the 2000s, this is basically when it became a conversation. And the reason that it became a conversation, the reason that people started aggregating it in these systems was so that they could create technologies like targeted advertisements, personalization also. They kind of went hand in hand. So the idea that my search results are different than your search results may not necessarily be directly for advertising. It may actually be the service that it's trying to provide me. So this kind of layer of personalization that they were able to provide by collecting personal data and then changing the technology around it. That was one really important thing. A couple other things that I think are really interesting that happen here, right? As we all put a computer in our pocket, this gave this continuous stream of data that was available. But actually something that I think is more exciting that came before this that we don't think about a lot is in 2000 when GPS basically became the sort of high precision GPS became available to citizens. So this means that by the time that the iPhone was launched, we all actually had high precision GPS receivers in our phones. So prior to the iPhone, there was already the ability to collect a lot of information about how we browse the internet, what sort of internet technologies we were interacting with. But when the iPhone came out, suddenly you could also include information about how we were acting and behaving and moving in the real world. But that was actually made possible by this sort of flip of a switch that gave us access to high precision GPS. So before 2000, any GPS device that you or I would run would have more or less the precision of a football field. And then when this became available, it kind of dropped down to like the precision of your kitchen counter, right? So suddenly all of this data is available and technology companies are using it for personalization, for selling you ads. And this huge marketplace sort of opens up as well, because now suddenly not only can they collect data to give you better technology or to sell you an ad internally, but they can also sell it to other third parties that then can do the same things, right? So suddenly data has a huge value in these systems and to move across different members of the system. Okay, so then with the emergence of data and this like new period of centralized technology, we saw kind of two network effects play out, which were equally sort of impactful and very interesting. So the first concept is just the plain network effect, which I think most of you are going to be familiar with, right? It's like if you and I were to join if I was the first person to join Facebook, it's going to be a very lonely place, right? But the second that another person joins, it becomes sort of exponentially more valuable, right? Actually, in number two becomes really, really valuable. And then for every person that joins after that, it continues to grow exponentially in the value because you can make the connections across that network. It's actually the edges of the network that are adding the value. And so for every new node, you're adding so many new edges. Okay, so for those you know, early, mid, and late 2000s, we actually saw network effects play out in how people were building technology, but also how technology was being funded. So a lot of early emergent technologies was being funded because it had a promise of network effects. So this is what essentially people were rallying around as being needed. People needed to build, and so you saw technologies, right, like Facebook, but you also saw you know, Tumblr, you saw Instagram, you saw Twitter, you saw these places that would have these strong network effects emerge, and big technology companies came out of them. Sort of a little bit later to the game, we saw the second network effect, which is the one more interesting today, which is the data network effect. And this is a concept that that basically says, you know, if I have some amount of data, it's going to grow exponentially more valuable the more data I have. And that's because we've become algorithmic, right? So companies use algorithms, create models that then can layer new value on top of raw data. And what we've seen is that the more data you have, the bigger and more interesting those models can become. And so we see that, right? We see that in all those original actors that had sort of the vanilla network effects. They sort of tried to collect as many users as possible. And then we've seen them sort of shift now to trying to figure out how to make their data as valuable as possible. Another way to think of data network effects is, I like to think of it as data gravity. So the more data you have, the more data you're going to want to collect, and it's going to actually change your behaviors and change your motives quite a lot as a technology company. And so this is kind of an older study, but if you go to labs.rs, I think is their URL, there's a group that has a couple of different really interesting write-ups, and a couple of them dig deeply into what it means to be Facebook, and what their data really means. And you can see just the scale of what they have. I think this is back in 2016, the amount of data that they're collecting just from people. This is just from people using their core platform, right? But also then when when Facebook starts thinking to themselves, working in a data network effect where each new source of data is exponentially adding value to them, they go out and start collecting a lot of different sources of data. And so here's a sample of the different partners that Facebook has for pulling in data and also selling derivatives or selling derivative information from that data. But they have a ton of different partners, okay? So that list goes on and on and on. And more about the data gravity is then we see companies that, you know, that try to expand their reach beyond the walls of where you go to use them. So you don't have to go to Facebook anymore to be essentially sharing your data with Facebook. You don't have to go to Google anymore to share your data with Google. They've found new ways to collect data from around the web. So something like 80% of websites online have trackers, 15% of pages are monitored by 10 or more, 60% of your loads contain a script from Google, and 30% from Facebook. So a huge number of, a huge amount of your online behaviors are now being collected by just a few different people, but well, by a lot of different organizations, and then a few of them are collecting a lot of it. And I think it's really interesting looking at a number like 60%, because it's already large. But then if you think of information that servers can get about your entry and exit to web pages, that number actually would go up quite a lot higher about what they actually know that's outside of just where they load scripts. Okay, so this may alone not be a bad thing. Like I obviously, I have a bias here, so this is kind of tempering my bias a bit, but it definitely has led to a lot of good and interesting things. I don't know if it outweighs the bad and dangerous things, but it's there. But more important today, it's definitely shaped our thinking about personal data. So most people that we know that talk about personal data have only ever experienced personal data within one of these systems. They've experienced it where you create your personal data without ever thinking of it, and then you give it to one of these companies more or less freely for them to do whatever they want with it. And so another way to think about that is that Well, none of you have probably ever, or probably have a record of every place you've been over the last year. There are literally dozens of companies that are trying to collect that about you and about me. And that's their primary output of energy, is trying to get that data so that then they can aggregate it or create derivatives of it and sell it, or use it for their own algorithms. So, and also the other thing that's so interesting about that is that while it's shaped our kind of understanding of personal data in this period, it's also been a period of just a rapid expansion of the amount of digital data that each one of us creates and the dimensions of our own self that it's describing. And so while we're kind of complicit in just giving away our data, it's actually more and more data and more personal data that we're giving away. So yeah, so I said, maybe it's not bad, but what is wrong with having so much personal data in centralized systems? One obvious one is that they all sort of represent single points of failure. And so I don't know if you remember back in 2015, there was the hack of the Ashley Madison site, which is a site for people that wanted to have affairs. And it was really big news, right? Probably because it was salacious news, but 30 million people were hacked. And at the time, this was a chart showing kind of how big it was relative to hacks that had already happened. But since then, we've just continued to see other cases of these single points of failure fail. Equifax here in the US compromised a ton of people's personal information, financial information, but it was already dwarfed by not one, but two different Yahoo hacks. And if you go to I've Been Pwned, you can just see all the different ones. But actually, if you haven't gone there, I recommend you go there and throw your email addresses in there to see the times that they've been parts of these hacks. And so you can see over 5 billion different accounts just in this one site that works to aggregate all the different hacks and make that information available. And so while this is one reason why the centralized systems are potentially bad, it doesn't mean that decentralized systems are going to be immune to those problems. I don't know if you remember, it dwarfed in all those other problems, but Heartbleed was a really big problem, and that's more or less existing in one of these open decentralized systems. But the reason was totally different, right? The reason for Heartbleed was you could primarily point at lack of funding and engineering time and dedicated minds around those systems anymore, but it's still there. There's other reasons. Centralized systems tend to have unknown motives, right? There's no kind of transparency to know why or for what reasons Google or Facebook or Twitter or any of these centralized companies are doing what they're doing. They're also prone to censorship. It's very easy for a government to ask a single point of a company to help them censor, and so we're seeing that actually play out in countries right now, and we've heard it play out for the last 15 years. And then there's abuse of power in these systems, and so what are they allowed to do, and how can they use your data against you? And that's a lot of what we're seeing today with the Facebook cases. And so that gets me to the blog post that I shared in the announcement for today, and it gets so interesting because if you look at all the hacks that have happened, you could more or less say that was incompetence or a mistake. There was no nefarious actor inside of these companies that said, let's open a door and let somebody in. The real difference here is that now we're seeing companies not go out and solicit bad people to come in and use your data, but their motives have completely changed. So back to that idea of the network effect flipping, what we're seeing is that as centralized systems grow and aggregate value, they sort of cap out. They hit the top of their S-curve as far as how much value they can get by adding more users. And so they want to keep growing in value, and so then they go and seek how to get the most value from their users, right? So how they turn your data into value. And then our entire relationship with these companies flips, and we're not really aware of when that flip happens. But you get some evidence of it having happened through things like the stories around Facebook right now, right? Because what this wasn't necessarily a hack or a leak. This was actually an API that Facebook built, and it was being built the way that they had designed it. You could call it a leak, but that was information that they were trying to make available to companies. Whether or not they were trying to do it, like let a company get 100 million users, is maybe they weren't, or definitely they weren't. But that was the design that they had built. Okay, so that's a few more reasons why centralized systems and personal data are potentially bad. And the last one is monopolies. And monopolies kind of, I think, interplay with all of the other ones, because the effect of monopolies on the other reasons why centralized systems are bad is big, right? So if there isn't competition, there's very little reason for these companies to make systems that are better for us, right? So if there's no other social network for me or my family to go to, then we either have a choice of using the social network that's available or not taking part in that kind of technology at all. And what I think is pretty wild about this is the difference of scale here is like, today, if you wanted to start a company that was going to compete with Facebook directly, like a centralized company competing directly with Facebook, a social network for sharing and things like that, you would never really get investment. It would be so hard to get investment today, because any investor knows that Facebook, more or less, they have all of the users already, and then they're going to squash you. But what's so interesting is that the scale between you and Facebook is huge. The scale between Facebook and Snapchat is smaller, but you can still see such noticeable differences in the network effects of Snapchat versus Facebook. And so, for example, if you ask somebody if they would leave Snapchat, their reasons for leaving, and this is total guesswork here, but their reasons for leaving Snapchat, or reasons for not leaving Snapchat, would probably be because it's fun and it's, they like going there because of the content or things like that. If you ask people their reasons for not leaving Facebook, it's because they'd actually be concerned that they'd miss things from their family or they'd miss things from their best friends. There's a real difference in that kind of network effect, I think, that's huge. And you can see how that's actually used in coordination with the data that they have available, that's used by Facebook to keep a competitor like Snapchat down. There's some really interesting stories. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Facebook's VPN app, but their use of data from the VPN app to measure how successful Snapchat features were before Snapchat said anything about them, so then Facebook can determine what to do with that. But so they're using data and they're using their scale to really maintain that monopoly. Okay, so fortunately for us, the pendulum is hopefully already swinging the other way. And so in that blog post, Chris Dixon says crypto networks use multiple mechanisms to ensure that they stay neutral as they grow, preventing the bait and switch of centralized platforms. So the bait and switch he's talking about is that flip from the moment where the value that a company is creating is by getting more users, when then they flip it to saying, we're going to create more value by extracting value from our users. And so that bait and switch is protected against in decentralized systems. And that's a really interesting thing about this moment. And so I don't think I need to really talk to this group too much about this current momentum towards decentralized systems. But we're seeing it grow, and we're seeing it become more and more sort of broad in its applications. So going from sort of pure currency to things like, games already, which are much more consumer applications. But this blog post goes through kind of mapping out a bit of the landscape of where we are. He's talking about it a lot from what's the value of these companies, but you can really see kind of the diversity of what groups are trying to work on and putting all the pieces together build a real landscape of decentralized technologies and the utilities, the protocols and the utilities, all the way up to the consumer application layers. Okay, so one of the things that I find kind of interesting in all of this is that in all of the centralized systems, personal data more or less existed in a two-sided market. In some cases, the two sides of the market were fulfilled by a single company, and in other cases, the two-sided market is fulfilled by two or more parties. And so I want to show you a couple examples along that spectrum, and then talk a little bit about how decentralization, or how personal data in decentralized systems needs to fulfill this two-sided market. So on one end of the spectrum is an organization that owns both sides of the market. You could say that Facebook is a data seller, but they're not really. They sell sort of pinhole sort of views into their data, and then they give you ways to act on it, but they don't really sell you any of that data per se. So Facebook owns the entire network, and then their users, the direct users of Facebook, are the ones that create that data. And then Facebook creates algorithms and tools from that data, and then they sell only that controlled view. So a little bit further along the spectrum is somebody like Foursquare, who maybe originally was much more like a Facebook, but they didn't stick with that. When they had the bait and switch, right, they decided to much more explicitly sell your data. So they own the network, the direct users create the data, and then Foursquare creates a marketplace for that data. So you can go and buy insights about different, foot traffic in buildings or whatever exactly they sell through their Pilgrim SDK. And so it's a little bit less centralized, right? Because they have a market with multiple actors in it, and they have some demand. But again, it's not demand of their original users; it's demand of the people that are buying that data. And then we go a little bit further, and this is a company called Factual. And so they actually build a real marketplace. They do have some tools where they collect original data from users, but primarily they're aggregating third-party data sets. So they're buying data sets from other companies that have small footprints, or, well, if you or I were to look at it, it would look like big footprints, but compared to the Facebook's pretty small footprints of users, and they get those different data sets, they clean them or standardize them, and then they sell them as APIs or however companies want to use them. But so they're really facilitating a much more complete marketplace. But again, the users they're actually tying together two different centralized players, the centralized buyers and the centralized sellers, and then they're also a centralized marketplace. And the users aren't really involved in that at all, because they're actually any person who's creating data is actually creating data within one of the other organizations that's selling data to Factual. Okay, so in a decentralized system, the idea here would be that users would manage or control the data, and then they would create the data in multiple different systems. So any place that you go in a decentralized system that you create data, that data should be something that you own and control. And then you would have the choice of giving third-party applications or algorithms access to that data, either limited pieces or large streams of information, perhaps. And then the only reason that you would ever exchange that data with a algorithm or an application is if you got actual measurable value back. And that measurable value is something that I want to talk a bunch more about. So how do we actually build a marketplace like that in a decentralized system? The tough thing is that you actually have to bootstrap the marketplace, and you have to bootstrap not just a marketplace, you have to bootstrap both sides. You have to bootstrap data creators and applications and algorithms that want to consume that data. If you were to create, say, a Facebook, you could create both sides, but it would be hard not to be very centralized. But so I want to talk about 4 different strategies that I'm seeing for potentially building this kind of marketplace in a decentralized system. So the first one I'm not super familiar with yet. I'm familiar with an example of it pretty well, but I haven't really thought about the mechanics of it and how it evolves through time, because I think it's a really interesting idea that could be expanded pretty nicely and it's a great way to get early traction and kind of like prove that there's both sides of the market. And that's to actually leverage centralized data creators in a decentralized exchange. So imagine kind of like the factual example from before, where all parties are fully centralized. In this example, the marketplace itself is decentralized, so the buyers and sellers can be centralized companies, no problem there. The marketplace will be completely decentralized, and then it can, over time, potentially evolve into other decentralized organizations working with it. And so a really nice kind of popular example of that is the Ocean Protocol, where they're bringing in people like autonomous car manufacturers who can contribute data from driving around, with the idea that if they can exchange that data where they all can get smarter from it, then they'll all benefit. And so this is one nice example. Another way that we could bootstrap the marketplace is to actually pay for original data. So this is an example of, okay, we want to get developers to build new types of applications and new kinds of algorithms that interact with decentralized data, decentralized personal data. So the only way that, the idea here is that the best way to do that would be to actually bootstrap original data sets and then get the developers to come use it. And the way that we'll bootstrap the original data sets is just to pay for it. And so this has previously been called a personal data exchange. And so we've seen a couple of examples of this, a couple decentralized examples of this. So Wibsyn and Data Wallet. And so the idea here is that you go and me as an individual, I would go and download an application and allow it to collect personal information about me. And that personal information would then go to one of these data exchanges, and people could, then organizations could purchase it. And when they purchase it, I would get paid, right? So, but we've seen this actually before. So there's some interesting components of this when you put it in a decentralized system. But we've seen it before, and that has some big challenges. And so one of the biggest challenges is like, what is the actual incentive to the user? So I'm rarely incentivized to do anything for my personal data. So I don't use any applications that do anything very exciting with my personal data outside of maybe Strava. The rest of them are anything that happens with my personal data after I use an application is typically invisible to me. So, and that's true for most consumers, I think. And so most people don't think of their personal data. And so what is the value that it would take you to actually think about your personal data? And so there was a marketplace, one of these PDEs that existed, and it was totally centralized. And the estimate was it was like $8 a month for people to put their data into that, which is for some parts of the world maybe a lot, and other parts of the world a little. Unfortunately, the value of that data probably completely goes backwards to that gradient, right? So the people where $8 a month is not very much are the people whose data is going to be the most valuable in these systems. And so that's one way to look at it, that the actual money that you could give users might be tough to be an incentive for them to share their data. Another metric that I saw that I thought, okay, that's actually a pretty interesting way to think about it is Facebook paid $42 per WhatsApp user. And so that would be like and that accounts for all months in all the future profits of WhatsApp, if there were profits, or sort of all future value of WhatsApp. And so that probably accounts to actually much less than $8 per user, in the WhatsApp world. But another way to think about it. And so I think the biggest challenge here is going to be what level of incentive is going to be enough to get people to share their data, and where are you going to actually get that value? What kind of applications are going to pay that much for that data? Sorry, this is meant to be number 3, and this is one that I think is the most exciting, which is to create indirect incentives for original data. And this is exactly how centralized systems have done it to date, right? So I don't go to Facebook and ask, what kind of data can I trade here? I go to Facebook and use it for, catching up with my sister, or reaching out to a friend, or whatever you do. but I don't think about the data. I get some incentive that that's unrelated to the data, and the data happens to be a side effect of that. Right. So another way to think about it is people don't create digital data to sell; they create digital data as the side effect of gaining another perceived value. So I found this old study from 2011 said like 77% of people use Facebook for the feeling of belonging to a group. And so if that's the value that people are getting, how can we bring that value to decentralized systems? And for me, that's one of the biggest and most interesting questions. This study, really interesting, I think must, thinking of that, the timing of that bait and switch in the Facebook world, another number in here was something like 67% of people felt like Facebook didn't change their opinion on things. And so it was like at this time, I actually don't remember what Facebook looked like in 2011 even. And so I don't know how people's motives have changed. I'd be really interested to learn more about what people's motives are for using a system like that, to see how do we offset the incentives there to bring them to a decentralized system. But the idea here is that people want to be social, they want to connect, they want to share a photo, or they want to send a message. That's the real take home of that study. Here it is, yeah. So the 66% of people didn't agree that Facebook provides them with opinions about subjects. So I'm really curious how much these numbers have changed. Okay, so that gets me to the last and also incorrectly numbered, number 4. Perhaps we can create new incentives for original data in decentralized systems. So besides the last one, this is the next one that I think I'm really excited about, which is decentralized systems can do things for users that centralized systems have a hard time doing. And so, for example, decentralized systems have a great way to build in mechanisms for stopping censorship, right? And actually, we see a lot of systems really trying to push this forward as one of the primary motives or primary reasons to get people onto the platform and out of other so in this example, it's Signal, so out of other centralized messaging systems. But still, it's very hard if you were to think about the reasons for using Signal versus another messaging platform. Like, why would you use Facebook Messenger still today? But you don't see, we're not seeing the avalanche of people coming from Facebook Messenger into Signal yet. So there's still some more, issues of network effects, and there's still some maybe other issues of incentives that we need to figure out. Another new kind of incentive that we can give people are things of ownership, are ideas of ownership, proof, and identity. This is another area that we're kind of excited thinking about at Textile, which is like, take for example, our first data that you can enter in your wallet is a photo. And so you can take for a photo, and I'm sure that you've talked about this in other sessions, but you could sign that photo and put an encrypted signed version on a blockchain. And basically nobody would ever be able to prove, nobody could ever disprove that you took that photo at that date and that time if everybody agreed on the blockchain and you had proof that it was there. If anybody could ever show that they had a date before yours, then maybe there'd be a dispute there, and they'd obviously be the original creator of that photo. But you could do this same concept with things like, for example, fingerprints. You could do it for your location data. You could do it for a lot of different kinds of data, which maybe you want to have a complete and private record that you can always prove. You can always prove the authenticity of that record if you ever need to. And then the final incentive that I'm really interested in is actually just building better technology by allowing people to store more of their information. So the line of thinking here is that most people that are becoming sort of conscious of how much data centralized systems are collecting are very wary of giving more data, right? So you don't want more companies to collect your location data. You don't want to provide more permissions for companies to collect more kinds of data about you. But in a decentralized system where you could actually own and have full control and privacy over that data, around that data, there could be some incentives for you to do things like put all of your digital data in. Why not actually have what one person told told me was, call it like the keylog your life, right? Why not store every keystroke in your full digital record? Because if you're the only one that can ever access that without permissions, there may actually be some really interesting technologies we can build on top of that if we can make that kind of service available. And the reason that people could be sort of might be willing to do a key log of their entire life in a private wallet in a decentralized system is that there is, like Chris Dixon says, there's not as many opportunities for that bait and switch. So a company that's enabling that for them couldn't turn around and say, okay, now we're going to keep that data and sell it on you. So that's about as deep as I can go on the incentives. And I really actually just wanted to put all of these ideas out here and talk to this group and learn, learn what kind of feedback you had and questions that you might have. But a couple of things that we know that we still want to learn is, like I mentioned with the, even though Signal is far and away a better messaging platform than Facebook Messenger as far as your privacy and control goes, we don't see that onslaught of users leaving Facebook yet and using Signal. And I can point to a number of different cases like that where the technology is obviously better in transparent or decentralized systems. And but maybe there's other incentives that we're missing to get people to come. And what those incentives are, we're not sure yet. I'm really curious, as we see this pendulum move more, hopefully continue to move more towards decentralized systems, I'm really curious what kind of interoperability is going to be necessary at different phases. So how much do we need to make decentralized systems work with the Facebooks and the Googles and the WhatsApps of the world? Like, how much do we need interoperability in order to maybe make those people able to move without, put one step in our world without having to take both feet out of the other world? And then I'm also very curious, and this is why I put it into the talk, and I'm very curious how the two forms of network effects are going to play out as we move towards more decentralized systems. So if we're successful in building decentralized systems that people want to use, what are network effects going to look like if there aren't sort of centralized single applications or single companies where all of these people can basically be sure to interact? If there's a social network for every town or social network for every group, and those have interoperability across them, it's a different kind of network effect. Not to say that that's how it plays out, but that decentralized way of thinking has a different effect here. And same goes for data. I'm really curious how projects like OpenMind go and thinking how decentralized personal data working in those systems can have data network effects too. But so I want to open it up for questions now and just chat with all of you and get some feedback. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation from my side. Anyone here has a comment or questions? Please go ahead.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a great presentation, and at least it triggered in my mind a lot of questions. So one thing actually I noticed, or I'm curious to understand, is the concept of identity. So if you look at Facebook or if you look at Google, to a large extent, a lot of energy they spend trying to ensure or try to get the real identity of the person, right? So if you go, they try to make sure that the data is associated to a real person. Yeah, I mean, you could argue that there are ways around that, but still, that they do make that effort. And in decentralized systems, if you want to actually create a data network effect, or you want to use that data that you created, one of the central questions basically comes down to, okay, how do people know that it's your data, right? In your case, like in the textile website that or app that you're building, how do you ensure that the photo that is being uploaded is actually not copyrighted or not somebody else's photo that somebody just happened to upload first, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious to think about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I haven't, we spent a lot of time a few months ago kind of going down a little rabbit hole in that area, and I haven't returned too much. But one thing that we did figure out was that that with a concept like, we were particularly thinking about the digital wallet, a digital wallet for your personal data, and what application that would have towards your question of like identity. And it's kind of interesting, your pairing of it, like how do you solve the identity in order to make the data valuable, right? So what we were thinking was the role of the wallet, or sort of the role of the wallet might not be to prove that a person is a person. So I couldn't take your digital wallet and say, you are a person on the ground someplace with a human body. That could be really hard. But what the wallet could potentially do very effectively is to say that this entity is the same entity now as it was previously. Okay, so this person today is the same person writing data into the wallet as the person was yesterday writing into the wallet. And when you have that, it gives you sort of a long-term record with which you can start building the necessary metrics of trust and reputation, which is what you need in order to use the data. So if a person has some sort of trust and they build a reputation, then that data becomes more valuable and easy to use. So that's kind of as far as I can answer that question, but kind of closer to my thinking.
Another question I have related to the subject is the layers of the internet stack of technologies, if you will, that you can act on. And I'm not well aware of all the different technologies that allow the internet to exist, but I kind of have the sensation that at some point we're going to solve the data issue at its most fundamental layers at some point, I think, whereby the only way to interact on the internet will be from a place where all your information, the data that you are generating, is stored on some sort of private server by default, right? And so you will build from that your interaction with internet at large. And so there won't be, I think, or the way I'm seeing this, is that in the future, this won't even be an issue anymore, because on a fundamental layers, that's going to be different. The way you interact with on the internet is going to be different. And maybe what you're describing as solutions right now are solutions that will make this transition feasible. So to make that interoperability working in the meantime.
Yeah, I like that thought a lot. I think that's really close to some of the ways that we've been thinking about this. Some of the kind of like precursors to our current path were our thoughts around how the future of technology has so many different sort of like agents trying to ask for information about you. So where you're going, what you want to do, what's going to make, like what room temperature do you need? Like that's sort of the long-term future, is where technology is interacting with you nonstop. And in that future, you don't want to have a user interface at all. You want your data to always be answering those questions as much as possible. And so that is actually a future very close to what I think you're describing.
Yeah, exactly. I remember that videos from, I think it was the New York Times, that did it about WeChat in China, where it uses a generic sort of template like WeChat, on which many different applications can plug in, right?
Yeah.
And this is obviously centralized and not very much different from what we have today, but the same general idea could be expanded and translated into the decentralized world. at some point. And I don't know if you're aware of a project that I've seen about that, which is Urbit, which I find very, very interesting.
How do you spell that?
Urbit, URBIT.org.
Cool, I'll check it out. Yeah, so our thinking behind that was with the, so I didn't spend too much time talking about the textile, what we're trying to build, but our idea was, okay, we want to actually get people to populate this personal source of data. We thought a digital wallet had it was a nice way to describe it, because the people that we were going to be communicating with early on were already going to be familiar with the concepts of the wallet and how it relates to encryption and privacy and ownership. And so we started thinking, okay, what would it take to get people to put their private data in a digital wallet, with the end goal that that digital wallet is something that they could take with them to any other service. And so our thinking was, currently not many people want to collect any of their data. It's just not, it doesn't have personal value the same way as it does as an aggregate value. But we kind of settled on this one kind of data that people already understand ownership. They already have a sense of value around it, and they already have a sense of privacy towards it, which is personal photos, digital photos. So we basically are building the first application that interacts with your digital wallet, and that application will put your photos into that digital wallet, and then we're building the APIs on the wallet that let you interact with other services with your photos. But the whole ambition there is that you could then take that wallet and move the whole wallet to another service. And so if we're successful, we wouldn't even be the only photo application using the app or using the wallet. There would be 20 different photo apps, and you at any time could move your wallet to any different app. Long-term futures, you could imagine that wallet would be doing exactly what you're saying if we're successful and we could get into that far future.
Yeah, I can see that happening. My only concern with the approach you're describing is that the user is going to have to understand the value of the data at some point. And I think with photos or private things in general, but photos is a good example because it's visual.
Yeah.
You actually realize the value it has when there is a problem with it, right? Whether it's a breach of security or whatever.
Yeah.
But in general, I think, and I kind of see this in some projects around blockchain and personal data, is the lack of awareness of the public and the lack of ambition from those projects to actually make people understand where the value of personal data actually is.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Have you seen any good solutions? Any good sort of education, or what is the solution?
Well, no, not really. I'm kind of interested in the subject too, so we might keep discussing it.
Yeah.
Afterwards. Yeah. But I think this is where a big chunk of the way to make that transition work is going to be to go along with the user into digging into the data and actually educate the user a little bit more about himself or herself with the help of her personal data. I think that can be very powerful.
Totally.
Yeah. More than putting a price on the token.
The data in other services, that's when the value starts coming out, right? So if you take the centralized platforms today, like Laurent was talking about WeChat, it's basically a network effect of the suppliers as well as the consumers, right? So the WeChat platform provides a common data standard for people to actually use it, and then as more and more people use it, the value of the data comes up. So yeah. I think one of the things that we need to actually work on or try to figure out is, in addition to actually just building the wallet and holding the data, also try to figure out a way for us to exchange that, or a common standard for people to be able to consume that, now when I say people, not just the end users, I'm talking about all the other businesses, right? So
yeah.
That's the network effect from the business side. I think that would actually.
Totally. Yeah. I agree with that totally. So I think there's some opportunity here for, and I think you might have touched on this in your first question, which is like there's some opportunity here for some kind of oh no, sorry, it was actually the second question, but some kind of like protocol or some kind of standard for or set of protocols or set of standards for accessing private data in your wallet. So if you can imagine, one example I like to think of because it's very visual is like street traffic maps. So if you imagine trying to do a street traffic map, today the way that it's done is an application just tries to gather as much, or it tries to get an application on as many users' phones as possible, and then it uses the GPS and the speed data from that phone to create live traffic maps. And so that's the old system. And so if you imagine if we all had private wallets, how does that system work on the private wallet to still create a live traffic map? And so maybe you need a system for algorithms to work collectively on the wallets. Maybe you need a different system for algorithms to work on a single wallet and exit the wallet with only the information that they say that they're going to exit with. Those kinds of protocols or standards, I think, will be really interesting to solve.
I think you're going down a very interesting path, Andrew. In fact, actually, I had seen recently one article on MIT where they're talking about this project. They're calling it the OPAL initiative, that is the Open Algorithms Initiative.
Yeah.
And the idea essentially is that you have the data central in your wallet or under your control, and the algorithm basically is vetted by you in some sort of manner. Maybe algorithm, and then you either do it manually or follow certain key metrics are passed. And basically, the idea essentially is these algorithms then come and then work on your data individually and to provide push back only aggregated data or in some kind of vetted data, which basically would be enough for the traffic for the central application to create the overall picture without necessarily invading privacy. Right?
Totally.
So definitely, I think that's definitely seems to be a direction that a lot of these initiatives are going, where you basically hold your data, your state, have people come in and using the standard protocol that we're talking about, interrogate, ask for, pay for, or incentivize in some way, and get the kind of the subset of the data, or the view of that data that they require, and then you basically are compensated for it, either in attention or in either by services or in monetary terms or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely something that's going to quickly start becoming.
I have also a question. Sorry. About this type of incentive structures you were explaining. So the indirect and the direct one, which at the moment in the centralized, they use the indirect one. Also, I assume for the reason that if you put direct incentives, so you pay people for their data, don't you think that this might lead to a huge bias in the data? So let's say, I don't know, I make this up, but rich people don't want to sell their data anymore, and poor people, So what do you think about this?
Well, I mean, I didn't want to dwell too much on those approaches because I don't find them alone. in their like just that state, I don't find them like super hopeful. I think those projects probably have a lot of other interesting ideas for how to do it besides purely just paying people. But I think that concept of like just paying people to incentivize the market, I think it's the incentives aren't high enough. And then, yeah, like you say, the sample pool isn't going to be anything like a real sample pool. And so, yeah, I just see it being really hard. Is that it's actually, you know, we did a lot of kind of research in this area before we kicked off our like current approach to the wallet, and we looked down this path a little while to determine if it seemed like the right way to go, and we hit these same questions. And we're just like, this isn't why people join systems. And what our goal is really to get people to join a new set of systems. And so, yeah, paying people didn't seem like the solution. So yeah, I'm with you.
But you also don't know, apart from tracking the behavior like it is right now, you haven't come across any other innovative way of of getting the data and incentivizing by an indirect way.
Well, I think the traffic map is a really interesting example, right? Because you can actually like have something of a hybrid indirect direct incentive. So like nobody that's going to want to use the traffic map is going to deny necessarily, except for strange or extreme cases, which is totally reasonable. Nobody's going to deny you to put their data on the traffic map. And so you can look at those type of exchanges. They have, if you do that kind of work on the traffic map, to stick with that example, it then has scale problems. If that's your only source of information, your traffic map is going to be sort of empty if you're waiting for everybody to pull up the map in order to put their data on it. So you have to have some sort of, and I don't know if it needs to go all the way to a token, but you need to have some sort of exchange where the amount of information you're reading is some proportion to the amount of information that you're giving, and that amount of information you're giving probably needs to be a lot more than what you're getting. Yeah, so those sorts of things become a little bit different than just those black and white indirect incentives.
So something like a wisdom of the crowd. So you get the final result if you let so like Wikipedia, you can track my data on Wikipedia, and then I can read everything on Wikipedia. Okay, now it's for free also, but well, it's not for free. That's already the problem. But then we would get the collective result of everyone, but only if you. Okay, that's nice.
Yeah, like so. Yeah, so well, actually, we're already seeing that kind of behavior in possible futures of Wikipedia, where the actual cost of Wikipedia isn't actually editing. I mean, there is a ton of energy that goes into editing, so maybe there's be some work there, but a lot of their cost is simply hosting and serving that data. And so, if you were making your network available to host and serve, it would be very low cost to you directly financially to host and serve, say, 20,000 pages. And that could easily open up to you to read for free hundreds, if not thousands of pages. So that's, again, it has that sort of scale difference. And with that, the scaling of the network becomes pretty easy.
Nice. Okay. Anyone else? Any questions, comments?
Maybe... quickly, if I can. I really liked your presentation, Andrew, in the way you were describing the different solutions. And I think, if I recall correctly, that the first potential solution was the one led by the Ocean Protocol project from BigChainDB, which is quite interesting. And I'm curious to know, what do you think about the use of curated markets in doing exactly that? So take a bunch of data and let the crowd vote, stake, have an opinion on those data, up to the point where you have, say, some sort of quality standard reached in order to be used in some application afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's a really famous economist who did a lot of work on this phenomena of super predictors. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, it was basically like it's been a long time since I followed anything there, but this idea that yeah, essentially wisdom of the crowd, but then within the crowd, again back to the reputation components within the crowd, there's some actors that are super valuable to actually like predicting or potentially making data valuable. Actually, I did a bunch of work with an organization some years ago on citizen science. So my background is actually in biology, and we were doing a lot of work in citizen science 6 years ago or so. And there's an organization here in the US that has a lot of different citizen science projects. So we did work with them on a project called Old Weather. They also do Zooniverse, where you a bunch of different astronomical projects. You go out and you identify planets and things like that. And they have a bunch of talks online worth looking at too, where it's so interesting when they're trying to figure out if a citizen scientist's data entry is valuable or not to their system. They can actually make they can actually play with that data to make it more valuable than just the raw inputs. So things like, you know, again, back to the idea of the super predictor, some users' input, you know, is going to be really, really good because they've been doing it really, really good in the past. And then some users, you know, are just going to always be putting in bad information. But that bad information can oftentimes be inverted and be used as either it can be used as good inputs by directly inverting it, or it can be used as detector of like automatic detector of other bad information. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of really interesting work to do there, but it's kind of out of my domain. Those are kind of the couple neat examples I know that could be worth looking at.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, we'll
Okay.
see. I think it's time to get to the conclusion.
Yeah, I think that was a really nice session. I really liked your presentation. It was really growing from step by step, historical and also in the content. Thank you so much for this, and also really nice discussion. And yeah, then see you next time, next Sunday. Have
Thank you,
a
everyone.
good week. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thanks, everyone.